really good. Our speaker tonight is Rita. She'll be talking on understanding the mind of God. Pretty intense stuff. She's currently a third-year PhD student in social psychology. Her research focuses broadly on culture and religion, and why it is that humans are not always jerks to each other, which is a very puzzling thing. She's interested in how religious beliefs operate in societies, how the content of religious belief influences social actions, and how cognitive dispositions lead people to believe or not believe. She addresses these research topics through lab-based approaches in Canada, and then experimental approaches and ethnographic approaches and fieldwork in Yasawa, Fiji. Before coming to UBC, she received her BA at Washington University in St. Louis, and she double majored in psychology and anthropology there. And something you might not know about Rita is she has 3 accidental tattoos. So read into that as you may. I know there's a question and answer session, so if you're curious, you can save it for then. But for now, join me in welcoming Rita.
Thank you, Doug, and thank you guys for showing up to listen to me talk about how beliefs can be shaped by human psychology, ecology, and culture. So in my abstract for this talk, I started out with the question, does God know what's in your fridge? And perhaps more importantly, does God care? So while the details of your grocery shopping might seem trivial to the all-natural, the almighty, what people say about their gods can actually tell us a lot about the society and how they interact with their environments. So before I get any further on this, I want to specify that I'm not talking about what beliefs should be, but rather I want to frame the conversation about how beliefs are, and specifically what people say about their supernatural agents, so spirits, gods, anything that's outside of the natural world, and acting on the world around them. How are these beliefs spread, and why do some of them keep going while others die off? And most importantly, how do these beliefs interact with the wider range of ideas and practices within that culture? So where are we going with this talk? First, I will tell you about how certain cognitive mechanisms give rise to religious belief, how culture can promote certain beliefs while demoting others, how ecology shapes social groups, and then how individuals gain social value within those groups, and how culture propagates across time and follows people around. And then finally, how God's thoughts and concerns can shift support to different cultural frames over time. So first, psychology. The cognitive science of belief started around 20 years ago, and they've begun isolating different cognitive mechanisms that actually probably evolved to help us think about other humans, but have been over time co-opted into beliefs about non-human agents that may or may not be active in the environment. So the first one that people talk a lot about is anthropomorphism, and that's this human-like dog here. So this is just the idea that non-human things can have human-like traits. So this leads to ideas that weather patterns, religious objects, pieces of toast can have supernatural or human-like characteristics. Second is the mind-body dualism, or the idea that minds and bodies can be separated. And this helps us figure out how agents in our environment are acting as opposed to non-agent things like a desk. So this leads to the idea of things like a non-bodied agent can be watching us even though we can't see them, or the persistence of the soul after death. And then finally, the idea of teleology, or the concept that everything is done for a purpose. So this is where we get the idea of things like, not only did Sally's house fall down in that hurricane because of the forces of the wind and the water, but there was actually an agent who caused that to happen, probably because of something that Sally did or didn't do. So this is a nice sort of framework to start things out, but it does leave some sort of, something not quite totally satisfying, which is, why do some agents get called God, but others don't? So for example, lots of people in this room might say that the Abrahamic God is real, but they wouldn't say that Zeus, who's pictured in this statue here, is real. even though once upon a time there were quite a few people who thought Zeus was as real as you or me. And to that end, why not someone like Santa, who is an unseen agent that watches us and rewards us for good or bad behavior, but again, we think the Abrahamic God is real, but not Santa. And even more to that point, why not say Mickey Mouse, who is a super Mousean agent that has all these human-like characteristics and can make our lives happier, but yet doesn't get to be called a god in the same way. And the answer to that little paradox is culture. So what I mean by culture is the body of practices and cognitions that are accumulated within a social group over time, have to be learned from other people, you can't learn them by yourself, and are typically in response to the environments that those social groups inhabit. So the way that beliefs are propagated through cultures is through practice and explicit teaching sometimes. So for example, you can use pedagogy, as this woman is in teaching this child to read the Holy Bible, or you can transmit beliefs through group practices like this prayer meeting for these kids in Cambodia. Or you can use more extreme rituals like these Hindu children who are practicing the kavadi, which is a piercing ritual that is in response to a Hindu goddess. And the more that people both engage in these acts that invoke the spirits, and especially as they're more costly, they're more likely to transmit the idea that the agents behind these behaviors that are causing people to do these things are worthy of belief. So one question that might come from that is, who are people likely to learn from? And you can get at that partially by how people are grouping themselves together in these societies. And one dimension that these people can be grouped together in is through the tightness or looseness of cultural groups. So the diagram over here, these are both social network diagrams. This one, the spots are individuals and the lines are the links among them. And you can see people are mostly clustered together in probably family groups. And they mostly only interact across groups through a certain mediating, probably leader of a particular group. And contrast that to a looser group where the individuals are acting more autonomously and connecting with each other more equally. So how might cultures become tighter or looser? And for those of you who are wondering when the ecology would come in, this is it. Part of how people respond to stresses in their environments is through uncertainty. When people are unsure about what's going to happen in their future, they're far more likely to cling closer to known social others, especially kin. So as this migrant mother from the 1930s in Dust Bowl America shows, when people are worried about climactic events, poverty of resources, poverty of money, or social tensions like warfare, they're far more likely to preference trusting only and dealing only with people that they immediately know. And in contrast to that is, as people are more exposed to reliable social institutions that can keep other things that might be causing them worries in check, such as a police state, welfare state, then people often feel more comfortable in extending their social groups beyond just their immediate family. So one of my favorite demonstrations of this effect is from a study by Semin and Rubini in 1990. They went to 3 different cities in Italy, and the nice thing about Italy is they have a lovely little gradient of tightness or looseness in the cultures within the country. So they went to Trieste, which is in the north, and they're one of the more individualistic cities in the sample. They also went to Bologna, which is in the middle, and they're kind of in between in terms of collectivism versus individualism. And they went to Catania, I think that's right, in the south, which is in Sicily, and more of a tight collectivistic culture. So they went to these cities, and they asked people to list every insult or expletive they could think of. They got these big lists of curse words and categorized them in terms of whether they were directed at the listener's family or directly at the listener. They tallied them up, and they found that the city in the south had a far higher concentration of the insults that were aimed at family members. Whereas up in the north, it's much more equal whether they're targeting the listener or the listener's family, and in the middle, they're right in the middle. So this is a neat little effect. But another interesting thing is that this difference across cities in Italy can be linked back to their history. And so Robert Putnam, in his book Making Democracy, points out that there was a deep difference in the governance of Italy in their past. So the northern states were originally more collective republics, more likely to have strong mercantile trade and good institutions that were supporting people interacting with each other outside of the family. And he contrasts that to the south, which were more ruled by the monarchy of the Kingdom of Sicily, which also happened to be constantly trading hands between the French and the Spanish over years of warfare. So according to Putnam, part of the reason why the North is today far more economically stable with much less unemployment and much more individualism is because of those strong institutions supporting market trade that they had way back a couple hundred years ago. So another way that we might think about how cultures can vary is how people within these social groups can gain social value. And this sort of goes orthogonally to the tightness-looseness. And the three different sort of patterns in cultural variation that psychologists have talked about are cultures of honor, cultures of face, and cultures of dignity. So an honor culture, you can think of like medieval Europe, the codes of chivalry, where knights are very manly and they go out and they fight for the honor and value of their king, their close group, and the honor of the women that they are protecting, whereas women are very chaste and proper and supporting the men. And cultures of honor are far more likely to be found in places where there's a lot of herding. People are pastoralists, and they often are living in rough sort of hill country that's much harder to farm for crops. And so part of this also entails a distance from other sorts of people who might be preventing cattle raids, for example. So in order to protect your flock from having all of your animals wander away with the help of a particular raider overnight, you have to show how tough you are and how much you are not to be messed with. The other one that also has a lot to do with favoring local groups rather than more distant groups is a culture of face. So one thing you could think of is, for example, Downton Abbey, and how there is a very structured hierarchy within the manor house, and everyone has their particular job within that hierarchy. So part of how you gain value there is in your deference to the duties that you have as part of that hierarchy. And even though Victorian and Edwardian England is a good example of how that works in Europe, this term culture of face or saving face actually comes from English interaction with the Chinese in the early 1800s. And the strong hierarchies that they have there have been in place for thousands of years and are very deeply ingrained in the way that people think about each other, and have been a very important way that people have talked about social cognition in the East versus the West. And then finally, the culture of dignity should be familiar to most of you, as Green College is about the best example of a dignity culture you could ever hope to find. Dignity culture is very individualistic. People are autonomous, and people's value comes from within them, and it is an immutable value. No one can take it away from them. So movements that support human rights, any kind of sexual liberation, or moving away from traditional values is typically within a dignity culture. And they're also much more likely to be found in places with strong secular institutions of justice and market trade. So even though I would like to go on and on about all three of these variations, the fact of the matter is, in psychology at least, there really isn't much data outside of a dignity culture. Part of the reason for that is that most psychologists really only like talking to undergrads. So because of that, we know a lot about undergrads, but not much about anyone else. However, we do have some indication about honor culture, if only because of the way that the United States has come up in history, which is what brings me to how culture of honor came into the psychological discussion to begin with. And this book by Richard Nisbet and Dov Cohen was one of the first major findings about how the culture of honor has influenced American life. And they start off with this observation that people in the southern US have this weird trend. So they looked at murder rates as committed by non-Latino white men, and they find that strikingly, these white men are far more likely to murder someone else who is, one, known to them, and two, somehow was involved with a interpersonal argument with them. So that's what these yellow bars here are showing, that not only on, first of all, more rural and small cities, the top graph, but also in general, these white men, if they're going to be committing murders, are far more likely to be doing so in the context of an argument. And on top of that, when you go into the look at the legal responses to these crimes, juries are far more likely to find the idea, well, he had it coming because I was insulted, is a far more compelling defense than in the North. So they wanted to go beyond just the correlational finding and see if they could actually experimentally induce people from these different regions to have a physiological response that would be much more like an actual aggressive act. So what they did is they were in the University of Michigan. They recruited 2 groups of white university students, men. Half of them were from northern states, and the other half were from the South, and they defined the South as having lived in a southern US state for at least 6 years. And what they did is they had them all come in, they gave them a sort of a cursory explanation of what the study was going to be, and they gave them this information sheet that they wanted them to go fill out at a table at the end of a hallway. But in order to get to that table, they had to walk past a Confederate, so someone who was in on the experiment. And the narrowness of the hall made it so that the person who was working at this particular drawer in the hallway was blocking the participant's path to the table, so we had to get out of the way to let the participant through. So that happened, they went, they filled out the paperwork, and then coming back in the experimental condition, the person at the drawer would slam it shut and then say asshole to the participant as he was walking by. And in the control condition, he just closed the door, the shelf. So as you can see with this couple of graphs, the yellow line is how the southern US men responded. And they had a big spike in the experimental insult condition in their stress hormone cortisol. And they also had a big spike in the hormone testosterone, which has been linked to aggressive and dominant behaviors. So this is important, first of all, because it can show that this culture is following these men around, in the sense that this happened in Michigan. And also that it can be induced experimentally and even on the level of physiological response. And in terms of culture following you around, the culture of honor itself, as it exists in the United States, can be linked back to Northern Ireland and the province of Ulster, where many of the ancestors of the people who are the progenitors of this culture of honor come from. So these 2 pictures are images of murals that were painted in Belfast in the late 2000s. Both of them have been recently painted over because they were symbols of hate. But they're associated with a separatist group that was pro-Protestant and pro-independent Northern Ireland. And so the top image shows the red hand of Ulster, that's the northern province of Ireland, with the Southern Cross, which is the emblem of the US Confederacy, in the middle, so showing their common linkage. And then the bottom image here is a mural depicting portraits of US Confederate generals who were from Ulster Scot heritage. And it says, sons of Ulster who led the Confederate Army in the War of Northern Aggression. So the history of this particular group can be linked back to a group of border raiders called the Border Reivers, who lived along the border of Scotland and England in 1500s to 1700. And these raiders were herdsmen, and they lived along this steppe area that was very hard to grow crops on. And the long history of warfare between Scotland and England leading up to the 1500s had a really strong effect on breaking down the local institutions there, such that people in these groups, if they wanted to successfully maintain their herds, had to really prove how tough they were. And so this lighter square here shows a place called the Debatable Lands, where no one in England or Scotland really had control of this area. It was mostly just border reiver territory. And they would They would engage in different battles with either side, but mostly they were affiliated with each other rather than either country. So, come the reign of King James I, he was quite ready to be done with this group. And on top of that, he had a bunch of Irish Catholics who were resisting and trying to oust him in favor of a Spanish Catholic monarch. So he decided he would solve both problems at the same time by moving the lowland Scots, including the border reivers, to the Ulster Plantation. So the Ulster Plantation was an explicit program to try and change over Catholic rule in Ireland in favor of Protestants. So the tan areas here are where Scots were settling before the beginning of this program, and the red areas are Scottish migrants during the program. So ideally, James would have liked these to be Anglicans, but Presbyterians are good enough. At least they're not Catholics. But over a couple hundred years, things were still not going great for all of the Scots who moved into Ulster. They were not only having troubles with Catholics, but also with the Anglicans. And so they decided enough is enough. They would go try their luck in the New World. So many of them emigrated to the American frontier and very quickly came to prominence as great heroes of the wild frontier, like Davy Crockett, who was of Ulster Scot background. And when they moved to the US, they're called Scots-Irish or Scottish-Irish, Scotch-Irish. But you know, in addition to being great American folk heroes, they also were involved in other programs to oust native groups like the Trail of Tears and the program by Andrew Jackson to evict the Cherokee, who Andrew Jackson was also Scots-Irish. Flash forward to today, and where do we find most descendants of the Scots-Irish in the US, but in the South, where this culture of honor is proliferating. So, you might wonder, what does that have to do with religion? Well, if we go back to modern Northern Ireland, these are two maps of Londonderry and Belfast. The green areas are majority Catholic neighborhoods. The red areas are majority Protestant. And as you can see, they're still quite segregated. So Londonderry is where Bloody Sunday happened, and that was the riot in the 1970s that sparked a lot more of the support for the IRA and a lot of violence for the next 30 years or so. And then Belfast, they've had riots even as recently as last year, so it's still quite a problem. And if we look back to America, or Merca, many of my fellow liberal Americans will find a lot of what most irritates them about US culture is probably linked to descendants of Scots-Irish as well. So this is a picture of Phil Robertson. He rose to prominence as one of the founders of a duck call company in the show Duck Dynasty. And he was recently kicked off because he made some homophobic remarks. And so while the liberals didn't like what he was saying, many of the Republicans, like this Republican thinker, found him as sort of like a clarion call to unite around what's wrong with this country, namely that we are not honoring our founding fathers and making it a Christian nation that they wanted. And you can also link this back to, say, the Westboro Baptist Church and their claims about what God likes, or in this case, what God hates. And to push the point even further, you can link it all the way back to Abraham and his ancient descendants in the region of the Levant between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea. They were pastoralists who, again, would value the manliness and the virtue of their shepherd sons who would go out and defend their flocks against raiders and animals. And they also highly valued the sexual purity of the women who would produce lots of sons and manage the households. And even though we only really have the surviving texts to go on to determine what ancient Israelite society was like, we can look at the nomadic pastoralist tribes that live in that same area now, the Bedouin, and they are definitely in a culture of honor, in the sense that they are pastoralists, and they have very strict honor codes about what makes a good man and what makes a good woman. And if someone's reputation of honor within a particular family is damaged, they damage the whole family, which is what leads to things like honor killings and other sorts of really strict codes of behavior. So from this, we might begin to make more sense of how there's a tension in the way that modern followers of Abrahamic faiths have trouble dealing with the traditions and texts that are handed down to them, especially if they were originally from a culture of honor, but being used in a current dignity culture. So for example, the God of the Old Testament, the ancient Israelites, is very harsh and punitive. For example, in this image of the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, an entire city is just wiped out. And a woman who looks back to the only world she's ever known is turned into a pillar of salt, just because this city wasn't living up to the code that this particular God said was what needed to be. Contrast that to the God of the New Testament and religious leaders whose quotes have been turned into posters. This God is far more loving, far more forgiving, far more uplifting, and importantly, the God of the Protestant belief is very focused on how you believe in him. And it has to be a right sort of orientation to belief, whereas in more of the Old Testament, you can focus more on your practice, and your belief is a little bit less important. And this focus on belief actually shows up in the way that psychologists have talked about what is proper religious orientation. So Gordon Allport was a very famous social psychologist, and in the 1960s, he defined religious orientation in two different ways. You could be intrinsic or extrinsic in your religiosity. Intrinsic religiosity is marked by engaging with religious beliefs and practices for the sake of religion itself, whereas an extrinsic religious person would do things more instrumentally for political or social affiliation or emotional support. And even though this has gained a lot of traction in psychology in terms of finding how people with intrinsic orientation have more well-being, better health, generally happier. You should also note that these are mostly North American and European Protestants who are participating in these studies. And unwittingly, this is also a very ethnocentric definition of what religion is, because most traditions don't actually seem to care much about belief at all. It's more about practice and being a good person. And the fact of your believing in that agent behind that practice or not is somewhat irrelevant and possibly a completely senseless question. So the other interesting thing that comes out of this is that some of the beliefs that we might inherit from those more rough and ready border raiders might also help push groups into a more dignity culture framework. So how does that happen? There's some suggestion in the psychological literature that people who believe in a God that is punishing or that can see you are less likely to cheat and more likely to be generous with people of their extended religious in-group. So from that, you get more of a chance to trust people farther away from your kin group and spreading out more of a circle of trust to build bigger and bigger societies that could eventually lead to the broad, anonymous, cooperative groups that we have in places like Canada. And that's what I got. Questions?